Thank you very much. Today I stand before this chamber to contribute on a report that should shock this government into action. The impact of the regulatory framework for cannabis in New South Wales is not just another document to be politely acknowledged and quietly ignored. It is a damning indictment of a system that is not just broken, it is actively harming the people of New South Wales. And the evidence is in the title of the inquiry, the impact. And there is a significant impact on the people of New South Wales and the government of this state. For decades, we have clung to outdated, punitive cannabis laws that have achieved nothing but harm. These laws have criminalised everyday Australians, workers, parents, veterans, and patients who simply choose a plant over other pharmaceuticals. It has wasted valuable police resources, forcing officers to focus on minor cannabis offences rather than on more serious crime. It has clogged our courts, turning simple possession cases into legal battles that cost taxpayers millions. It has handed a billion-dollar industry straight into the hands of organised crime, while the government sits idly by, foregoing the economic benefits of legal and sensible regulation. It has also forced thousands of patients onto the black market, where they are left guessing about the quality, potency and safety of their medicine. Meanwhile, cannabis use remains unchanged. It has not stopped. It will not stop. The only thing Prohibition has achieved is pushing cannabis use into the shadows, where it is less safe, less regulated, and more profitable to criminals. The evidence is overwhelming. Prohibition has failed, and that is what this inquiry is finding. Madam Deputy President, this report tears down the tired arguments for Prohibition and lays out a clear, evidence-based roadmap for reform. It tells us what the data has been screaming for years. Criminalisation does not deter cannabis use. It only ruins lives, leaving people with criminal records for a substance that is legal in other parts of Australia and around the world. Roadside drug testing is deeply flawed, punishing unimpaired drivers simply because THC can remain in the body for days or even weeks, long after any intoxicating effects have worn off. The cannabis cautioning scheme is unfairly applied, with Aboriginal and lower income communities far more likely to be charged rather than diverted. And the financial and social cost of Prohibition is indefensible, draining taxpayer money on enforcement rather than investing in education, harm reduction and smart regulation. But most importantly, Madam Deputy President, this report provides solutions. It does not just say what is wrong, it tells us exactly what needs to change. And I thank all the members of Portfolio Committee Number 1 who've been participating in this inquiry for their excellent collaborative work on framing and shaping the key recommendations from our first report. The first and clearest thing we must do is overhaul the Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act 1985. If we are serious about justice and fairness, we must rewrite New South Wales drug laws to reflect reality. We must redefine what constitutes a small quantity and a trafficable quantity right now. These thresholds are absurdly low, meaning that small-time users are being dragged through the justice system as if they were dealers. We must reduce penalties for possession, cultivation and personal use to either a fine or a maximum of 3 months imprisonment, instead of the current wildly disproportionate 2-year penalty. We must amend supply laws to distinguish between non-commercial sharing of cannabis and actual drug trafficking. Right now, gifting a friend a joint is treated the same as selling kilos to organised crime. This is not just illogical, it is unjust. And we must scrap the deemed supply laws that presume anyone in possession of a certain quantity intends to sell it, reversing the burden of proof on the accused and making a mockery of legal fairness. And I would put on the record, Madam Deputy President, that as a member of the Legalised Cannabis Party, these reforms are a departure from our stated policy position. This is a depenalisation approach. It's a reasonable first step, and I know that we are in the in the middle of the drug summit and the response and the outcomes of it. But this is a reasonable first step, and in particular I'd like to thank the Honourable Stephen Lawrence for his work in shaping these reforms and working with me in a bipartisan way on this. Number two is we must radically reform New South Wales Police search and enforcement powers. We must stop unjustified stop and search practices. Police should not be conducting invasive searches based on nothing more than a vague suspicion of cannabis possession. We must end these strip searches of minor cannabis offences, especially against young people, children and Aboriginal Australians, where these searches are disproportionately applied. The report makes it clear police should not be treating cannabis possession as if it were a violent crime. We must fix the deeply flawed cannabis cautioning scheme. The current cannabis cautioning scheme, while well-intentioned, is riddled with inconsistency, racial disparities and police discretion that allows bias to thrive. We must make diversion the default option. Right now, whether or not you get a caution depends on who you are and which officer you encounter. This is unacceptable and postcode justice. We must expand eligibility, increase the amount of cannabis that qualifies for a caution, and introduce an administrative expiation scheme like in South Australia so that minor cannabis matters are dealt with through fines rather than clogging up the courts. This is about keeping people out of the criminal justice system and focusing police resources on real crime, not on persecuting cannabis users. We must introduce real reform to drug driving laws. This is key and this must happen soon. The current system is punishing legal medicinal cannabis patients for driving unimpaired. This must change, and it'll be a matter that I'll be raising in the short term with the new Roads Minister, the Honourable Jenny Atchison. We must implement a medicinal cannabis defence as already legislated in Tasmania so that patients prescribed cannabis are not unfairly criminalised. And we must ensure that cannabis and alcohol use are addressed separately so that genuine impairment is targeted rather than the presence in the system. And I note, since our report was, we had our deliberative on our report, the Victorians have commenced their discretionary regime whereby magistrates can use their discretion and not necessarily remove a licence from those people who were caught and test positive by a roadside drug test in Victoria. We must introduce begin a staged pathway to full legalisation. A key, I would say, movement by my party, rather than asking for everything all at once. We understand that this is a major change, that we must bring people with us and do it in a staged and responsible way. It is time to acknowledge reality. Cannabis will eventually be legal in New South Wales. The question is whether we do it smartly or whether we let the black market continue to dominate. We must trial non-enforcement zones in certain areas to test the impacts of decriminalisation. And there is an ad hoc one operating right now in northern New South Wales. It is called Nimbin. And there are some issues there, but there are certainly some learnings that we could take from that Northern Rivers region in terms of non-enforcement zones. We must start investigating regulatory frameworks for a legal market, ensuring that tax revenue can be invested in health, education and harm reduction, because we acknowledge there are harms. The evidence is that there are harms from cannabis, especially we need to keep cannabis out of the hands of children. We heard from the experts, they said cannabis use in persons under the age of 15 is particularly harmful. And I would never stand in here and say that cannabis is always safe in all circumstances. We heard the evidence from health professionals that's an example where you can have misuse and real harm. So we need to educate young people about those harms. The way to do that, regulated, taxed, taxation and education. We must prioritise public health over corporate greed, regulating cannabis in a way that prevents over-commercialisation while ensuring consumers have access to safe, legal products. The government has, while initially making some good noises, is out of step with reality. Madam Deputy President, this is not a radical policy. This is a common sense, and the committee has set a pathway for a staged approach that I think the government should consider and support in due course. The ACT has decriminalised cannabis, and the sky has not fallen in. Just last week, I was down there. I availed myself of some delicious backyard cannabis. Plants growing, saw the video, absolutely beautiful, deep chunks, Salmon River hybrids of sativa, absolutely magnificent, a very uplifting high, I've got to say, and the sky has not fallen in Canberra. There is not a societal-wide malaise. There's not a massive. Well, there might be, but it's not to do with the cannabis. There hasn't been a massive reduction in productivity and a mental health catastrophe down there. What there has been is responsible adults growing, sharing cannabis responsibly from their backyards and reducing the cost and as responsible adults enjoying that recreation. Even conservative governments around the world are recognising that prohibition does more harm than good. And we only have to look to the United States, centre-left governments in Canada, and in Germany, which are moving in this area. Yet the Premier and his government refuse to even consider change. Instead, they have doubled down on prohibition despite knowing and being on the record that it does not work. That is not leadership. It is stubborn, politically driven, and I think it's cowardly. Let me be clear, the public is ahead of this parliament. The majority of Australians support cannabis reform, many of them working class, many of them young men, many of them a very powerful cohort of voters in regional areas, outer suburban areas that are looking for leadership from the government that will change the way they live and actually have a significant impact on cost of living. People could grow their own backyard cannabis ultimately and not have drink and not have to go to the black market. It could be a recreation that they can use responsibly and help them with their hip pocket, as well as a lot of other health and societal benefits as well. The community knows that change is inevitable. They look at the United States, they look at Canberra, they understand that it can work if it's done responsibly. The committee has taken the first step. It is put forward a reasonable and responsible, informed recommendations based on the comprehensive evidence from a variety of stakeholders. The report spells out exactly what needs to happen. The government can either act now and show leadership or continue ignoring the evidence and be remembered for it. With the New South Wales Drug Summit now concluded, we are waiting on the final report. But one thing is already clear. The people of New South Wales want change. The polls say it, all the analysis say it. Experts, health professionals, legal advocates, and even many members of this place have spoken with one voice. Our current cannabis laws are failing. This government cannot keep kicking the can down the road, hiding behind a further review. Ultimately, they will run out of political excuses. The summit was meant to provide clarity on the future of drug law reform. I hope it does, and I hope that the summit and these recommendations clear the pathway for responsible cannabis law reform in this state.
Thank you. Further speakers? Honourable Stephen Lawrence.